So let's move ahead to question number 2. Can we see a simple example of LINQ to SQL? Now what we'll do in this session is we'll try to understand that how we can use LINQ with SQL Server. As we have said in the previous sessions, basically LINQ is nothing but it provides a uniform query or a programming language across different kind of data sources like ODBC, XML. Probably you have Microsoft documents like Excel, Word, and then databases like SQL Server, Oracle. So LINQ basically sits on top of all these data sources and provides your client, that is your .NET language, a uniform way by which it can query or it can retrieve data from these data sources. So in this session we will see a simple example of how to use LINQ with SQL Server. So in other words, we will be exploring LINQ to SQL. Now before we move ahead and we start looking into the source code of LINQ to SQL, we'll first try to understand the concept of entity, because entities will form the base on which LINQ to SQL works. Okay. Now if you look into the way classes are designed or defined in projects, normally they are mapped to tables. For example, you can have a country table, okay, and then you can have a class which basically maps to the country table. Okay, I do understand that it's not normally necessary that your application model or your application classes are same as the database tables, but I'm talking about 80% times your table model is basically same as your class model. So what people do is that they say, okay, if we have a country table, okay, then we will define a class for it called as some class called as, I have named here as country entity, something called as CLS country or something. The properties of these classes basically maps to the column of the tables. Okay. Now these kind of classes are termed as entities. They basically represent your data model, or you can say they are name value representation of your tables. Now in LINQ we define entities using attributes. So for example, let's say that you have defined a class called as CLS customer entity. You can use the table attribute to define, saying that this maps to which table. So for example, here I'm saying that this is mapping to the customer table. Then you can define your properties. You can define saying that your properties map to which column using the column attribute. So in this way, using the table and the column attribute, you can map a class to your tables. Here's how the example looks like. For example, here I have a table called as customer, and it has 3 fields: customer ID, customer code, and customer name. At this moment I'm not utilizing the customer ID, so basically I have created two properties, one for customer code and one for customer name, and then I have mapped this class with the customer table. You can see that I have used the table attribute to map it with the customer table. I've used the column attributes to map to the respective customer code and customer name column. In order to use these attributes, you need to ensure that you have imported using system.data.link.mapping, because all the link mappings are stored into this namespace. So the first step is to define link entities. So for that you need to first import this namespace, define your class, use your table attribute to map with the table name, use the column attributes to map with the respective column names of your table. Okay, so now that we know that how to define LINQ entity objects, it's time to fetch data from SQL Server tables and flourish your LINQ objects. Now that's done by using data context. So data context acts like a bridge, or it acts like a connection object between the database and your LINQ objects. You can think about data context as same as the ADO.NET connection object. So here's how the source code will look like. The first thing you need to do is you need to import system.data.link, define your SQL connection string, and then create the object of data context and pass the SQL connection string. Now once you have done that, you can use the get table generic method of the context and flourish your entity, and then later you can just browse through the entity object collection and display the value. So the first thing what we did is we defined our LINQ class. We used the attributes, that is table and column, to map it with our database. At this moment my database is customer, so here's my customer table. So we mapped the customer property with the LINQ entity object. Then I imported system.data.link and created my data context class, data context object, passed in the connection string, use the get table method or the get table function to get my table collection of the entities, and then I just browsed through the link object collection. So let's run this project. You can get this source code from correspondvideo.com. In case you have bought the DVD, you can get the same from the source code folder. So basically this source code has a lot of other things, and we will be explaining that in the coming up videos, but at this moment it was simple link to SQL example, and you can see that we have just displayed the customer name. So it has displayed to me correspond and correspond IT. The same is in my table. So in this way you can fire link to SQL queries, using link mapping. So let me just see the data. So I've just displayed the customer name, correspond and correspond IT. And that's what is displayed on the browser, right? So this was a simple example of link to SQL, and what we'll do is that in the further coming sessions, we will go more into detail. Let's say that the customer also has multiple addresses. Let's say that the customer addresses has multiple phones. So how does link to SQL basically help to map this one-to-many and many-to-many relationship?